The sound of the airplane's engines hummed softly, the low rumble of an aircraft soaring through the sky. Inside, passengers settled into their seats, buckling up for the flight ahead. Among them, there was one woman who stood out, not just for her striking confidence, but for the weight of her uniform, a black female soldier, proudly wearing the insignia of first class, ready for her well-deserved rest after months of service. But as she made her way to her seat, something unexpected happened. Something that would change the course of this flight in ways no one could have predicted. The flight captain, standing in the cockpit, glanced at the seating chart just moments before the doors closed. His eyes narrowed as he spotted her name on the list. He knew exactly who she was, and despite her rank and uniform, his attitude was anything but respectful. In that instant, something inside him snapped. Maybe it was prejudice, maybe it was arrogance, or perhaps it was something even darker. But whatever it was, it led him to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of the flight. He refused to let her sit in the first-class seat she had earned, for no other reason than the color of her skin. Imagine the shock on her face when the attendant informed her of the captain's decision. A seat she had booked and paid for, one that was hers by right, was suddenly taken from her. The woman stood there, trying to process what had just happened. Was this a mistake? Did she hear that correctly? Unfortunately, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an act of sheer racism. She had been treated as less than, despite the honor she carried in that uniform. But what happened next is the part of the story that no one saw coming. As the plane ascended, the captain sat confidently in his cockpit, unaware that the woman he'd wronged wasn't just any regular passenger. She wasn't just someone who could be pushed around or intimidated. No, this was a soldier, someone who had spent years defending this country, someone who could handle adversity and wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. And so she did. Without hesitation, she made a decision that would flip the whole situation on its head. She wasn't going to let this man's prejudice slide. She wasn't going to be silenced or humiliated. She knew exactly what to do. But what she did next, how she confronted the captain and turned the situation from one of injustice to one of power, that's where the real story begins. The tension in the air was palpable. Passengers could feel it. You could almost hear the collective breath being held as this woman, this soldier, prepared to take action. The captain, no doubt, was oblivious to the storm that was about to hit him. But little did he know, the woman he had disrespected wasn't just going to sit back and let it go. As the minutes ticked by, the flight began to feel less like a routine journey and more like a battle of wills. It wasn't just about a seat on the plane anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and standing up against racism in a place where it had no place to exist. And when the captain realized his mistake, when he recognized just who this woman really was and the power she held, it was already too late. The damage had been done. But what happened in the moments after that? What was the captain's reaction when he finally understood the weight of his actions? Was he filled with regret, or was there something else that changed in him? That's the moment you won't want to miss. Keep watching, because the rest of this story will take you on a journey of redemption, regret, and the undeniable power of standing up for what's right. Stay tuned to see what unfolds next, because this is a story you won't want to look away from. As the plane ascended, the hum of the engines blended with the muffled chatter of passengers settling in. Some were reading, others were gazing out the windows, lost in thought, while a few were simply enjoying the calm as the skies cleared. The flight had started like any other, but for one woman, a black female first-class soldier, the atmosphere had shifted from ordinary to tense in an instant. She had been prepared for the journey. After months of hard work in service, she'd managed to secure a seat in first class, her well-deserved reward for the sacrifices she'd made, the late nights, the long deployments, the moments away from home. It wasn't just a luxury, it was a symbol of her dedication. She'd worked hard for this, and she wasn't about to let anyone undermine that, especially not because of the color of her skin. When she first made her way down the aisle, the stewardess had greeted her with a warm smile. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but it was enough to make her feel like she belonged there. She wasn't just another passenger. She was a soldier, someone who had fought for the freedoms that people like the flight crew took for granted. Her uniform wasn't just fabric and insignia. It was a symbol of pride, honor, and resilience. But as she approached her assigned seat, the smile on the stewardess's face began to falter. The woman felt it, a sudden change in the air. The stewardess hesitated, glancing at her, then back at the captain's seat up front. That's when the flight attendant's voice broke the silence, hesitating for just a moment before speaking. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the stewardess said, "but the captain has instructed us to ask you to take a seat in the rear of the plane." The words hit like a punch to the stomach. For a split second, she froze. It couldn't be happening. Not now, not after everything she had gone through. She had earned this seat. She was supposed to be in first class. The notion that someone would challenge that, especially based purely on prejudice, was beyond comprehension. But the stewardess didn't seem to be joking. She looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic, as though she were caught in the middle of something she couldn't control. The woman opened her mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. For a moment, she was stunned, unsure of how to react. She had never encountered something like this before, not in her years of service, not in her daily life. She had always been taught to rise above, to meet disrespect with calm dignity. But this was different. This wasn't just disrespect. This was an active attempt to erase her hard-earned place in the world, to make her feel like she was less than everyone else. The stewardess, sensing the tension, quickly added, "The captain insists that you move to the back. I'm really sorry for the inconvenience." The woman stared at the stewardess for a moment, weighing her options. She could protest, argue, make a scene, but she knew that would only add fuel to the fire. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her now, but it wasn't the kind of attention she wanted. She didn't want to be the center of an uncomfortable conflict. But at the same time, she couldn't just walk away and let this go. Not when so many people had fought for the rights she had today. "I've paid for this seat," she said quietly, her voice calm but firm. "I have a right to sit here." The stewardess's face reddened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned away, as though signaling to the flight attendants behind her. The woman's gaze followed the stewardess, and her eyes landed on the cockpit door, the place where the captain was waiting. She didn't know who he was, but she could feel the weight of his authority in that moment. It was clear he had made his decision before she even boarded. A sense of betrayal washed over her. How could someone who was supposed to be a leader, someone who had the responsibility of ensuring the safety and comfort of all passengers, turn a blind eye to the injustice unfolding in his own cabin? Was this really what it meant to be a captain? Was this what the uniform he wore stood for? She had always believed in the values of honor, fairness, and integrity. She wasn't about to let one person take that from her, not without a fight. As the minutes passed, her mind raced, formulating a plan. She didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but she also couldn't let this moment slip away. She had to stand up for herself, not just for her own dignity, but for the countless others who had been dismissed, ignored, or even silenced throughout history. She couldn't let that happen again, not on her watch. The captain, meanwhile, remained oblivious to the brewing storm in the cabin. He sat in the cockpit, his focus entirely on the flight ahead. He had the power, the authority, and the control. He was the one who made the decisions, who commanded respect, or at least, that's what he thought. But what he didn't realize was that respect wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to earn, and in this moment, he was about to lose it. The woman wasn't going to back down quietly. She wasn't going to let him define her worth. As the plane continued its climb into the sky, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The woman had made her decision. She wasn't going to let this go, not until she had made her voice heard. She wasn't going to be silenced, not by anyone. But there was something else in the back of her mind, something nagging at her as she considered her next move. If she confronted the captain, what would happen? Would he back down and apologize? Or would he dig in his heels, making the situation worse? Would the other passengers support her, or would they side with the captain? The uncertainty of it all made her heart race. But one thing was certain, she wasn't going to let this injustice pass. She had to act, and the choice she made would set the tone for the rest of the flight. The door to the cockpit was still closed, but she knew she had to face him soon. The tension was building, not just between her and the captain, but between her and herself. She had to be brave. She had to be strong. She had to stand up, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, unseen, or unimportant. But as the flight continued, the question lingered in the back of her mind. What would happen when the captain finally realized the mistake he had made? Would he regret his decision, or would he double down? Would he apologize, or would this be a battle that would go on far longer than anyone expected? The woman stood there, her mind spinning. The hum of the engines and the occasional creak of the aircraft felt distant, as if the world around her had slowed. She glanced at the other passengers, many of whom hadn't noticed the tension building just a few rows ahead. Some were engrossed in their own worlds, reading, sleeping, scrolling on their phones, oblivious to what was unfolding. But others, the ones who had caught the brief exchange between the stewardess and herself, were watching, their eyes shifting between her and the front of the plane. She could feel the weight of their gaze, some sympathetic, others judgmental. It was strange how quickly things had shifted. A simple act of prejudice, something so small yet so powerful, had turned a routine flight into a battleground of dignity. She could feel the anger bubbling inside her, but she knew that getting angry wasn't going to solve anything. It would only play into the captain's hands. He would see her as just another angry black woman, another stereotype he could dismiss. She wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. Her grip tightened on the armrest as she took a deep breath. She glanced down the aisle toward the cockpit door again, where the captain sat, unaware of the storm brewing behind him. She had to confront him. She couldn't just sit back and let him get away with this. But how could she do it without making it worse? She wasn't sure what would happen when she finally stood up to him, but she was certain that it was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds adjusted his uniform, his eyes scanning the controls in front of him. He was experienced, confident in his role as the leader of this flight. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, his ability to manage anything that came his way. But today, something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was an odd tension in the air. He had noticed the woman as she boarded, and something about her had bothered him. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was something about her presence that seemed to unnerve him. Maybe it was the way she held herself, the air of authority she exuded. He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. He didn't want someone like her in first class. She didn't belong there in his eyes. It wasn't that he had anything against soldiers, not at all. But there was something about her confidence, her self-assurance, that made him uncomfortable. He had his reasons, his personal biases that he had never fully examined. After all, he was the captain. He was the one who made the decisions. And in that moment, he had decided she didn't belong in the seat she'd booked. He convinced himself it was about protocol, about making sure the flight was comfortable for everyone. But deep down, he knew it was something else, something darker. As Captain Reynolds sat in the cockpit, his mind wandered back to the other passengers. He had seen a few glances exchanged, passengers looking at each other, looking back at him. He knew they weren't entirely happy with the way things were unfolding, but he told himself that he was in control. No one would question him. He was the captain. Back in the cabin, the woman was torn. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, but the uncertainty of the situation gnawed at her. She kept thinking about her time in the military, about the countless times she had faced difficult circumstances and overcome them. She'd had fought for justice, for equality, for a better future. She'd have faced prejudice before, but never like this. Not from someone in a position of authority. This was different. It wasn't just a casual slight. It was a deliberate act of exclusion. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every second that passed without action felt like an eternity. Her heart pounded in her chest as she weighed her options. She could go to the back of the plane, take the seat she had been offered, and pretend this never happened. She could avoid confrontation. But deep down, she knew that would be a betrayal of everything she stood for. It wasn't just about her. It was about all the people who had been silenced, all the voices that had been ignored. Her fingers traced the edge of the seat in front of her. She remembered the words of her grandmother, who had always told her to stand firm in the face of adversity. Never let anyone make you feel small, her grandmother had said. You are worth so much more than that. The woman knew her grandmother had endured so much more than she ever would, and yet she had always carried herself with dignity. She couldn't let that legacy down. As the flight continued, the woman's gaze remained fixed on the cockpit door, her thoughts swirling. She knew she had to act, but she wasn't sure how. She wasn't the type to escalate things unnecessarily, but she also wasn't about to let this slide. If she didn't stand up for herself now, when would she? If not now, when will it end? The stewardess returned a few minutes later, her expression apologetic. I know this is difficult, she said quietly, but the captain insists. I know what the captain insists, the woman interrupted, her voice calm but firm. I'm not moving, not until I speak to him. The stewardess hesitated, looking around nervously. Ma'am, I really don't think this is a good idea. I don't care what you think, the woman said, her resolve hardening. I'm not going to let him treat me like this. I've earned this seat, and I'm not going to let someone take that from me. The stewardess, still looking uneasy, nodded and walked away, likely to inform the captain that the woman wasn't going to back down. The woman's heart raced as she prepared herself. The confrontation was inevitable now. She had no idea how it would play out, but she knew one thing: it was going to be a turning point. Meanwhile, Captain Reynolds was still unaware of what was happening in the cabin. He had been busy with the usual routine of flying, checking instruments, making sure everything was running smoothly. But the nagging feeling of unease wouldn't leave him. He had the sense that something was off, something beyond the usual flight dynamics. He wasn't sure what it was, but he had a feeling it was about to make itself known in a way he couldn't ignore. As time went on, the tension between the woman and the captain grew thicker. The other passengers began to sense that something was wrong, and the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. People weren't just watching, they were beginning to whisper, to murmur among themselves. The walls of the plane seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with every passing minute. And still the woman waited. The minutes felt like hours as the woman sat in her seat, her hands trembling slightly. The weight of the decision she had made pressed heavily on her chest. She had never been afraid to speak up for what was right, but this felt different. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or a minor inconvenience. This was deliberate. This was personal. She watched the stewardess disappear into the front of the plane, her heart pounding as she imagined what would happen next. Would the captain come out and speak to her directly? Would he try to dismiss her again, or was he finally going to take responsibility for his actions? She had no idea, but she could feel the tension building, growing tighter with every passing second. The cabin was eerily quiet now. The usual hum of the plane, the murmur of passengers chatting, had all but faded away. It was as though everyone knew something was about to happen. The eyes that had once been casually drifting over the cabin were now focused on her, waiting for the next move. She could feel their gaze, some of them sympathetic, others full of curiosity. But there was one thing they all shared. They were all waiting for the same thing. They were all waiting to see how the captain would react when he was finally forced to confront the woman he had wronged. It wasn't just the passengers who were on edge. The flight attendants, who had once moved through the aisles with ease, now moved cautiously, their eyes darting between the woman and the cockpit door. No one knew how this was going to unfold, but everyone could sense that the stakes had been raised. No one wanted to be caught in the middle of a confrontation that could escalate quickly. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was beginning to feel the pressure. The unease that had been simmering in the back of his mind for the last few minutes was starting to bubble up. He had known the woman wasn't happy with his decision, but he thought she would back down. He had made it clear. His decision was final. But now, As the minutes dragged on and the silence thickened in the cabin, he started to feel the weight of the situation. He had assumed his authority would be enough to squash any resistance, but now something was different. The tension in the air was palpable, and he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of his control. He glanced at the cockpit door, his fingers hovering over the intercom button. A part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend everything was fine and focus on the flight. But another part of him, the part that had always prided himself on being a leader, a man who could keep his cool in any situation, knew he couldn't just let this go. He had to resolve it. He had to regain control. With a deep breath, he finally pressed the button on the intercom. "This is Captain Reynolds," his voice crackled through the speakers. "I'd like to speak with a passenger in first class, please, the one who's refusing to take her assigned seat in the back." The woman's heart skipped a beat as she heard the captain's voice echo through the cabin. This was it. The moment had come. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, and she knew they were all waiting for her next move. Would she stand up? Would she walk to the cockpit and confront him face to face? Or would she back down and let the captain have his way? For a moment, she sat there frozen. The weight of the decision was unbearable. She knew she had to do something, but what? What if the captain was even more unyielding than she imagined? What if he doubled down on his racist behavior? Could she face him without letting her emotions take over? But then something clicked inside her. She thought about all the times she had fought for something more, something better. She thought about the sacrifices she had made, about the people who had fought for her right to be here, to sit in this seat. She couldn't let this moment pass. She couldn't let him think that his actions had gone unnoticed. Taking a deep breath, she stood up. The movement was deliberate, slow, but full of purpose. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the cabin on her, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't about them. This was about her. This was about standing up to the injustice that had been thrown her way. The stewardess watched her, a look of concern on her face, but said nothing. The woman walked down the aisle, each step more resolute than the last. As she passed the rows of passengers, she caught glimpses of their faces. Some were watching with wide eyes, others with a mix of sympathy and apprehension. She could hear the soft murmurs of conversation, but she didn't stop. She kept her gaze straight ahead, her mind focused on the task at hand. When she reached the cockpit door, she paused for a brief moment, taking one last breath before she knocked firmly. The sound echoed through the hallway, sharp and decisive. There was a long silence before the door creaked open. The captain's face appeared in the crack of the door, his eyes narrowing when he saw her standing there. He had obviously not expected this. He had expected her to back down, to comply, to play along. But she hadn't. She was here, standing before him, ready to confront him head-on. "What do you want?" Captain Reynolds asked, his voice cold, his posture stiff. The calm, authoritative tone he had been using throughout the flight was gone, replaced by something else, something defensive, something almost fearful. "I want you to explain why you thought it was okay to deny me my seat," the woman said, her voice steady but unwavering. "I want to know why you thought it was acceptable to treat me like I don't belong here." The captain's eyes flickered, a hint of discomfort showing through the facade he had carefully built. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He was unprepared for this direct confrontation. He had expected her to be meek, to avoid causing a scene, but she wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't intimidated by his authority. In that moment, as the silence stretched between them, it became clear. This wasn't just a battle over a seat on an airplane. This was a battle over respect, dignity, and the power to define one's own worth. And in that moment, the captain realized he was losing. The silence between them stretched longer than either of them expected. The woman stood there, her stance unwavering, as Captain Reynolds' eyes flickered with uncertainty. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out. The power he had once felt so confident in seemed to evaporate the moment she confronted him. He wasn't used to this, wasn't accustomed to being challenged in this way. His mouth felt dry, and his hands, which had always been steady in the cockpit, now fidgeted nervously by his side. But just as the tension reached a peak, the unexpected happened. Without warning, the cockpit doors swung wide open. A new figure stepped into the doorway, another flight attendant, but this one wasn't like the others. She was wearing a military uniform, the very same uniform the woman in first class had worn. The newcomer's posture was sharp, her expression stern. She wasn't just any flight attendant, she was a soldier. The woman who had been denied her seat wasn't the only one in the cabin who had earned her place. The man in the cockpit froze, his eyes widening in disbelief as he took in the sight of his new arrival. The soldier's eyes were locked on him, and there was an unmistakable fire behind them. It was as though everything in the cabin had suddenly shifted. The woman from first class wasn't the only one who was about to confront him. Now there was someone else. "I believe you have a problem with my colleague here," the soldier said, her voice cool and commanding as she stepped closer. She didn't wait for a response, and her gaze never left the captain's face. "I'm Staff Sergeant Thompson. I've been listening to your little interaction, and I'd like to remind you of one very important thing." Captain Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came. He was stunned. The last thing he expected was for another soldier to step into the fray, especially one who had the authority and presence to back up her words. The stewardess who had left moments ago now lingered in the doorway, her face pale, as though she too recognized the gravity of the situation. The woman from first class, who had been standing silently by the cockpit, felt a surge of relief rush through her. She hadn't known what to expect when she knocked on the door, but seeing this soldier, someone who shared her experiences and her struggle, felt like a powerful reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. That feeling of solidarity, of knowing that someone was willing to stand with her, gave her the strength to keep her composure and face the captain without fear. Staff Sergeant Thompson's words rang out, sharp and clear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This woman is not just a passenger. She's a first-class soldier who has earned her seat, her place here, and her respect. You didn't just insult her. You insulted the very values this country stands for. And as someone who wears the same uniform as she does, I'm here to make sure you understand that." The captain's face turned red. He stammered, his usual confidence crumbling beneath the weight of the situation. He had no idea who this woman was, no idea that she had a deep connection to the woman he had so easily dismissed. He had assumed that the first-class passenger was just another entitled individual, someone who could be silenced and disregarded. But now, standing before him was a force he hadn't anticipated, someone who was more than willing to call out his prejudices. I was just following protocol," Captain Reynolds muttered, his voice now trembling. "I didn't mean to." "No," interrupted Staff Sergeant Thompson, her voice cutting through his excuses like a knife. "You meant exactly what you did. You wanted to make her feel small, to make her question her worth. But that's not going to happen. Not here, not now." The stewardess, who had been standing awkwardly in the doorway, finally stepped aside, allowing the tension in the cabin to become more palpable. It was as if the plane itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The other passengers, who had been nervously eyeing the unfolding drama, were now sitting up straighter, some of them watching in stunned silence, while others whispered among themselves, clearly shaken by the sudden escalation. But Captain Reynolds wasn't finished. He wasn't going to let this soldier, or anyone else, humiliate him. He was the captain. He was the one in charge. In his mind, this was still his plane, his rules. "You can't come in here and tell me how to run my flight," he snapped, his voice rising as he took a step forward. "I've been flying for years, decades even. No one tells me how to do my job." Staff Sergeant Thompson didn't flinch. She stood tall, unaffected by his outburst. "You don't understand," she said, her voice colder now. "It's not about your job. It's about the way you treat people, the way you treat her. The way you think you can just strip away her dignity because of the color of her skin. And that's something I can't just stand by and let happen." The temperature in the cockpit seemed to drop as the tension thickened. It wasn't just the captain's authority that was being challenged now, it was his entire worldview. In that moment, he realized that the woman he had dismissed wasn't just a passenger. She was a soldier. She was someone who had fought for his freedom, for everyone's freedom. She had a right to be there just as much as anyone else. The captain opened his mouth again, but this time, his words seemed to falter. He couldn't find the defense he was looking for. He couldn't explain away his behavior, not when faced with the reality of his actions. The realization hit him harder than any turbulence he had ever experienced. His heart raced, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. Meanwhile, the woman from first class, standing just behind Staff Sergeant Thompson, felt the weight of the moment sink in. She had watched as the captain tried to dig in his heels, but now, with the soldier by her side, everything had changed. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated the force with which it would be met. It was as though the universe had conspired to make sure she wasn't alone in this fight. But even as the captain struggled to regain control, the woman knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. The stakes had only gotten higher. There was no turning back now. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. Captain Reynolds stood frozen, his mind racing as he struggled to find words, but none came. Staff Sergeant Thompson's unwavering gaze held him in place, her presence commanding the space in a way he couldn't ignore. The passengers on the plane were no longer just bystanders. They were witnesses now, watching as the power balance shifted right before their eyes. The woman from first class, standing just behind the soldier, felt her heart thudding in her chest. She could see the captain breaking down, his composure cracking in front of everyone. She had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it, the sheer weight of what was happening, still hit her with a force she hadn't expected. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about the wider battle for respect and equality that so many had fought for, that so many still fought for today. And right now, it felt like they were winning. "You've made your point," Captain Reynolds finally muttered, his voice low and shaky, his hands trembling at his sides. He took a step back, seemingly defeated. "I was wrong. I shouldn't have done what I did." For a split second, the woman thought the matter might be resolved. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would let it go. But then she remembered the years of injustice she had seen, the countless apologies that were hollow and empty. She needed more than words. She needed action. "You can't just say you're sorry," she said, her voice rising now, full of conviction. "Apologies don't make up for the harm you've done. They don't fix the years of discrimination, the prejudice that goes unchecked. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to change?" Captain Reynolds opened his mouth, but again, no words came. The weight of her question seemed to sink in deeper than any of the others. He had never been forced to confront his biases like this, not in such a direct, undeniable way. He had been in positions of power for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to be challenged, to be made to face his own flaws. I'll make it right," he stammered, his voice barely audible. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." But the woman wasn't convinced. She had heard empty promises before. She had heard people like him say what they thought she wanted to hear, and it had never made a difference. This wasn't about him making things right for her. It was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been treated as less than. Just as the weight of her words began to settle in the air, there was a sudden jarring noise from the back of the plane. The passengers, who had been watching in stunned silence, now turned their attention toward the source of the noise. A loud crash followed by hurried footsteps. The woman turned instinctively, her heart pounding again. What now? Was someone else going to intervene? Was the situation about to escalate even further? But when the figure emerged from the rear of the plane, it wasn't what anyone expected. It was a man, dressed in a suit, his hair slicked back, his expression stern. He moved quickly down the aisle, his gaze scanning the cabin as though he was searching for something or someone. When his eyes landed on the captain, they locked with a chilling intensity. "Reynolds." The man's voice was sharp, authoritative, and it cut through the tension like a knife. What the hell is going on here? Captain Reynolds turned to face the newcomer, confusion flashing across his face. I'm just trying to handle the situation, he stammered, his voice still shaky. The man didn't seem to care about Reynolds' response. He moved forward, ignoring the captain entirely and stopping right in front of the woman from first class. He extended his hand toward her, his expression shifting from stern to surprisingly warm. "You don't know me, but I'm John Harris, the CEO of this airline," the man said, his voice now calm but firm. "And I've been getting reports from the ground staff about your treatment on this flight. They've been following the situation closely. And I don't need to tell you that this isn't how we do things at this airline, not on my watch." The woman blinked, stunned by the sudden appearance of someone so high up in the company. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected the CEO to show up, let alone intervene in the middle of such a heated confrontation. "I'm sorry for the way you've been treated today," Harris continued, his gaze now firmly on the captain. "And I'm not going to let this slide. I'll be personally ensuring that the proper steps are taken, that this doesn't happen again." Captain Reynolds' face had drained of color. He stood there, speechless, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world had just landed on them. The woman looked at Harris, still processing what was happening. She had expected a long, drawn-out battle. She had expected to have to push even harder to make her voice heard. But now, with the CEO stepping in, it seemed like the situation was taking an unexpected turn. But just as the atmosphere began to shift, a final, unexpected twist came. John Harris turned back to the captain, his voice lowering. "And as for you, Reynolds, I've already made the call. You're no longer fit to fly this airline. Effective immediately, you're grounded." Captain Reynolds' eyes widened, disbelief washing over him. "What? You can't do that. I've been with this airline for years." "I just did," Harris responded coldly. "And the fact that you think this situation was acceptable is all the reason I need to make this decision. Now, I suggest you leave this plane." The cabin was silent as the realization sunk in. The moment that had felt so close to escalating out of control had suddenly taken a different direction. The woman stood there, her breath coming in sharp, quick bursts as the weight of the situation settled over her. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or dismissed. As Captain Reynolds turned and walked towards the exit with his head hung low, the woman felt a wave of relief wash over her. But the relief was mixed with something else, something deeper. She knew this victory was just one of many steps in a much larger fight. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had made a real difference. As the plane began to steady, the passengers exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet approval, others whispering among themselves. The flight continued, but it was clear that something had changed, not just for the woman in first class, for everyone on board. The fight for respect and equality had taken a powerful turn, and no one would forget what had happened on this flight. As the captain disappeared from the cabin, his figure growing smaller with each step, a profound silence settled over the passengers. It was as though the entire plane had held its breath, waiting for the moment of resolution. The tension that had permeated the air for what felt like hours now began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief that seemed to ripple through the cabin. But there was also something else, a sense of empowerment, as though something had shifted, not just for the woman from first class, but for everyone who had witnessed the drama unfold. The woman, still standing by the cockpit, felt the weight of the situation slowly lift from her shoulders. Her hands, which had been clenched in fists just moments before, relaxed at her sides. She took a deep breath, her chest expanding as though the air was fresher now, clearer. The battle she hadn't even known she was fighting had been won, and though the victory wasn't without its cost, it was undeniably hers. John Harris, the CEO of the airline, remained standing in the aisle, his eyes scanning the cabin as though he were taking in every detail. He seemed to be taking a mental inventory of the passengers, his gaze moving from one to the other, as though he were confirming that everything was indeed as it should be. He turned back to the woman, his expression softening. "I know this wasn't easy," he said, his voice now gentler, more personal. "And I'm sorry it had to happen like this. But I promise you, we're going to make sure this doesn't happen again." The woman nodded, her throat tight. She had expected many things today: hostility, resistance, frustration. But what she hadn't expected was this. She hadn't expected the CEO of the airline to step in, to take responsibility. It wasn't just about her now. It was about a larger recognition that there was a systemic issue, one that wouldn't be ignored. The apology wasn't just for her. It was for all the people who had been made to feel less than, for all the instances when someone had been treated unfairly without anyone stepping in to stop it. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now, though there was a lingering emotion behind the words. "I appreciate it, more than you know." Harris nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a look of understanding. "We all need to do better. I'll make sure this is handled properly, and I'll personally ensure that the necessary steps are taken to rectify this situation. No one should ever feel like you did today." The woman's mind flashed back to the moment when she had knocked on the cockpit door, the sense of helplessness and frustration that had almost overwhelmed her. She had been ready for a battle, but what had happened had been something else entirely. It wasn't just about confronting the captain. It was about standing up for herself and for others. The path she had chosen wasn't easy, but it had been worth it. As the CEO moved away to speak with the flight attendants, the woman took a moment to look around the cabin. She noticed the passengers, who had once been so quiet, now exchanging murmurs of approval. Some were smiling, others nodding in solidarity. It was clear that the majority of them recognized the significance of what had just happened. They had witnessed a moment of change, a moment when one person's courage had forced a shift in the balance of power. At the back of the plane, Staff Sergeant Thompson stood silently, her eyes watching the woman, a quiet satisfaction reflected in her gaze. She had been the one to stand beside the woman, to give her the strength to speak out. The two of them had made a powerful team, and in that brief moment, it had been clear that they had each played a part in something much larger than either of them could have imagined. The stewardess who had been so nervous earlier now approached the woman. She had a hesitant look on her face, but there was a softness in her eyes. "I just wanted to say, thank you," she said quietly, "for standing up. I've been in this job for years, and honestly, I've seen so much. But today was different. You showed us all what it means to have courage." The woman smiled softly, feeling the weight of the words settle in. "Thank you. Sometimes it just takes one person to stand up, and the rest follows." The flight continued without incident. The rest of the journey, though long, was filled with a quiet sense of camaraderie among the passengers. They weren't just strangers on a plane anymore. They were witnesses to a moment of change. The woman could sense it in the way people glanced at each other, the way conversations had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding among them now, something that connected them in a deeper way. As the plane began its descent toward the airport, the woman felt a strange sense of peace. The moment that had started in conflict had ended in resolution, and though the battle wasn't over, it had been a small victory, a victory that had changed the course of the flight, changed the way she saw herself, and perhaps, just maybe, changed the way others saw the world around them. The captain's departure, though dramatic, had marked the end of an old regime, the end of a mindset that allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. The arrival of the CEO had been unexpected, but his quick action had been a testament to the power of accountability. The woman didn't know what would come next, but she knew that the ripples of today's events would be felt long after the plane landed. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever felt marginalized, overlooked, or silenced. When the plane touched down and the passengers began to disembark, the woman felt a quiet pride. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had set a precedent. She had shown that no one should ever be made to feel less than. And in that moment, as she walked off the plane, she knew that the fight was far from over. But today had been a victory worth celebrating. In the days that followed, the story of the incident spread. News outlets picked it up, and social media buzzed with conversations about the flight, about the captain's dismissal, about the woman who had stood her ground. The story was more than just a tale of one individual's struggle. It was a symbol of something bigger, a reminder that change was possible, that the fight for equality didn't have to be fought alone. The woman's journey wasn't over. There would be more battles, more challenges ahead. But she had proven something important today, that standing up, even when it's hard, even when it feels like no one is listening, can make all the difference. And with that, she stepped into the future, ready for whatever came next.